Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for what is our regular monthly webinar here at Friends of the Lake District. My name's Helen Howe. I'm the membership and volunteering lead. So thank you for joining us today. Um, just a little bit of kind of housekeeping in terms of how it all works. Um, our project officer, Jack, is going to be speaking today. So he should be speaking for about 30 or 40 minutes. It is a webinar setting, so the chat's disabled, so you can't kind of chat with us. But what you can do is at the bottom of your screen, you should see a little box called Q&A, and you can at any point throughout the webinar pop your questions for Jack in there, and then we'll read those out at the end. So the questions aren't kind of there for other people to view until we've answered them, but we'll pop them up once Jack has answered them at the end. And there should be plenty of time for questions and answers. So please get thinking of all the things that you would like to ask him. Um, so today's webinar is exploring the living landscapes that are dry stone walls. We're thrilled that Jack's going to be leading this. So Jack is a policy officer at Friends of the Lake District, but he's also a trained instructor for the Dry Stone Walling Association and has worked as a self-employed walling contractor. And he has a huge passion for the subject. It's fantastic heritage craft. And without further ado, I will pass you over to Jack.
Thank you, Helen. Welcome, everyone. These slides are not moving on for some reason. Let me try again. The slides are not moving on, Helen, for some reason. That's it. I've got them moving now. They're moving now. Forget that. So yeah, sorry, welcome everyone. So I'm going to cover the sort of evolution of walls and then cover some of the features in walls and what they tell us about the evolution of landscape, particularly farming, obviously. I'll cover the basic structure of a wall and then what sort of activities and opportunities are involved at the moment. Now, when it comes to walls, the first question I always get asked is how old is this wall? So what we thought we'd do, we'd start with a bit of audience participation, ask you 4 questions about whether you think you can identify the wall. So the first question we want you to answer, and Helen will pop the poll up in a sec, is do you think you can date a wall by the lichens, mosses and ferns, the volume and the species and the size of them which are in a wall? So Helen will pop a question up, and if you can put your answers in, that would be great. Obviously, we'll give you a minute to get everyone to fill that in, and then when the majority of you have put your answers in, Helen will put the answers up. Yep, so I can see those answers. So that's a pretty good answer, really, because in themselves, you can't date a wall by the vegetation on it. So the image on the left there, that's actually a southeast facing aspect wall in an open area on limestone. Now, you can roughly age the growth rate of lichens on stones and other features, which gives you an indication of how long that stone's been in situ. But of course, that doesn't necessarily mean you can tell the age of the wall. The image on the right there, that's actually a north-facing aspect, and you can see all the mosses there. They've predominantly formed because it's actually on the edge of a wood, under a tree canopy. And so it's actually the microclimate where the wall's situated has a far bigger impact on the growth and types of species rather than the age of the wall. So if someone says to you, oh, that must be an old wall, look at all those lichens on there, then the answer's not quite correct. So the second question, or the second aspect is, do you think you can tell the age of a wall by the shape of the stone and the size of the stones? Helen pops the question up. See what the answers are? Yeah, that's pretty good, really, as well. Yeah, so the shape and the size of stones, I'll come to this when I talk about the evolution of walls in Cumbria. They do give a reasonable indication of the age of a wall, but of course, if you think some walls might be, literally 1,800 years old, probably at some point in that time history they might have been rebuilt. and when they were rebuilt, there might have been other stones robbed out of other features nearby. So, yes, the size of the stone, the shape of the walls do give an indication, but you also need to look out for other little features. So that image on the left there, you can see that was actually one of the Andy Goldsworthy Millennium sheepfolds they did, obviously from the year 2000. Two master craftsmen based in Cumbria, George Allenby and Stephen Allen, built that one. Now, obviously, you can see there's quite an arty cone in the middle of that sheepfold, which is probably a bit of a giveaway to say it's fairly new. Whereas the image on the right, you can see those huge, big boulders, rounded boulders in the base of that wall. It's actually part of the Peel Promontory at Crummock Water, which actually encloses the site of the medieval manor house. So again, the presence of those very large boulders in that wall and the wiggly nature of it means they've probably just been rolled into place. So there were boulders laid in the field rather than quarried from a stone. So the next aspect is, do you think you can date the wall by the features embedded in the wall? And you can see there you've got a gate stoop and a step style. Helen pops the question up. Yep, so this is a bigger majority saying yes. Well, again, I'm afraid to say that they can only give an indication. It's a bit like for the previous reason that although that gate stoop has got a date on it, there's no reason to say that that gate stoop might have preceded the wall next to it, or it might have even been moved and robbed a bit. And certainly the ladder style, obviously that is a feature to enable people to get over rather than livestock, which if you think the boundaries were originally put for livestock originally, the gate stoop is in the Duddon Valley, and that is a beautiful feature you get in Cumbria, where these bits of slate are obviously quarried through, and I'll cover some of those early gate features later on in the talk. And the ladder style is quite a common one you see in Cumbria to enable people to step over, built with slate near Ambleside. So the final participation question to pick your brains is, do you think looking at historic documentation can give you a good indication of the age of the walls you're looking at? You'll notice on that map the little T's, now a bit like your deeds for your houses, where you've got the T on that side of that wall, that gives the maintenance responsibility of the ownership. So yeah, that's a pretty good answer. That's a good answer really, because you can see from the map underneath that they are classic what we call enclosure walls, which were the majority of the walls you see in the landscape today, which is still standing, are these enclosure walls. So the Enclosure Acts roughly started about 1750 and ran through to about the 1860s. This one is actually one of the later ones near Kirby Stephen in 1855. And the big giveaway is the straight rectangle shapes of the fields. And where you get that more sort of regular shaped fields, which I'm going to come on to, they are really enclosure walls. And the enclosures had a huge impact on our landscape. So it's estimated that about 26% of the area of the old Cumberland was enclosed through walls and hedges and other enclosures, and about a fifth, about 20.5% for the Westmoreland area. I often have a joke in my mind. I think, well, would Friends of Lake District objected to all these features enclosing all this beautiful communal space before? And I think the probably answer might have been a yes at that stage. And obviously, after the enclosures, after about those 1860s, obviously metal work became more prevalent and cheaper. So particularly the later enclosures were further up the fells and on the steeper land, which hadn't been done before. And that was more costly, and it was easier to bring in your metal work and materials. So you see that on the old fence lines on the fells. So this is again is another enclosure image. And you can see two distinct patterns of agriculture there. On the right-hand side, you can see Troutbeck. You've got the old sort of pre-enclosure, well, obviously that was the earliest forms of enclosure in that valley bottom land where the farmland was generally richer. Whereas on the right-hand side, that was obviously the later enclosure walls. So one of the earliest walls to be go up in the valleys was along the base of the valley, and that was a really big, chunky, thick wall, often called the ringgarth or head dyke, which basically, in effect, was put up to protect the valuable vegetable growing and the cropland in the valley bottom, close to where people's settlement was. And those walls were generally stone gathered from the valley of the floodplains themselves, because in effect they were clearing the fields of the rocks in order for cultivation. And those walls, generally by the nature, are wigglier. The stones are often rounded because they've been, weathered and eroded and moved by glaciers, brought down by becks and streams into the fields and used that way. Whereas the enclosure walls, because they came on later, and they were surveyed by surveyors on drawing rooms, and the stone was generally quarried. They are generally straighter lines, and often the shape of the stone is a bit more vertical because they're not built by rounded cobbles. But as I say, I'll come on to that later on. And there's an overhead image of Wasdale Head, and you can see there those beautiful wall shapes in that valley bottom, enclosing that most rich, fertile land and protecting it from any of the wild and then later domestic herbivores coming, jumping over from the fell and getting into that land. You can also see in some of those fields some mounds of stones, and that's what we call clearance cairns. So at some point, particularly in these valley heads where you've got a lot of flooding events, there was so much stone on the land, they built the big walls, and I'll show an image of a big consumption wall later, but they also had stone spare, and so they piled them up into great heaps to provide a bit more cultivation space. So it's a really lovely image, that. And if you look down, Langdale, Eskdale, it follows a similar pattern to that. So the very oldest walls, you can still see a lot of them in the landscape. Some of the oldest stonework is obviously Neolithic, but in the lakes, a lot of the early walls are these sort of early Middle Ages, the medieval period. And they're often form a very low bank. And at the time of use, they weren't actually the only feature. Often the tenant farmers would actually dead hedge on top of these very low wall banks. So they'd put, hedge stakes and then they'd weave dead brash in to build the height up to keep them stock proof. And often there was sort of restrictions and agreements written into their tenancy agreements to make sure they did that. And actually, indeed, just before I go on to the next slide, that old slide, often where there's a modern enclosure wall, sometimes you look on the ground and you can see one of these very ancient old mounds where there was, a medieval wall. And then when the Enclosure Acts came on, it was actually quicker for them just to build and erect a new stone using quarried stone. Now, the image on the right actually isn't in the Lake District, but we've got a lot of examples similar to this. This is in the North York Moors in a valley called Glaisdale. You can see in the base of that wall, you've got these vertical, huge stones, and they're called orthostats, which basically roughly means stones standing on their backs. And again, this is an indication of a very old, simple wall where there wasn't the stock numbers, particularly the sheep numbers. It was mostly cattle and other livestock, so there wasn't the pressure to jump over these walls. But there are lots of examples of that. And generally, when you see these types of features, it's probably certainly medieval, and actually there might be some features going back slightly earlier. And so these are the oldest walls in the landscape. So just going back to that, thinking of that image I showed at Wasdale Head there, this is in Eskdale. And this is one of these consumption walls, and you can see the huge width of it. This is on the road up to Hard Knot Pass, heading up from Eskdale over towards Coniston. Some of these walls are like 8-10 foot wide. They're just amazing. You can see they're built from in this case, granite rounded cobbles. And as I say, they are so wide because they basically cleared all the stones away from the edge of the field and allotment to create the cultivation space. And that image on the right there, that's one of the early deer parks. This is an amazing example from 1560, built for Lord Wharton in the Ravenston Dale parish in sort of East Cumbria. These are some of the early examples of the sort of modern way of constructing walls with a double face of wall with stones, with obviously through stones in between. And certainly this period from about 1500 to 1750, before the enclosure kicked off, a lot of the walls were about power, status, and sort of ownership. You know, this is where I'm going to hunt deer, and I don't want all the plebs' livestock encroaching and getting in the way of my hunting experiences. So it was very much the manorial acts and the lords and the courts and things which generated some of the older walls before the enclosure acts at the late sort of from the 1500s into the 1700s. So this image, if you know the Central Lakes, you might know this. This forms part of the wall of the Fairfield Horseshoe up near Rydal and Ambleside. And again, this is fairly old wall. I think it's dated roughly about 1565. But again, it's quite a big wall. It's higher than your modern sort of standard wall. It's about 1.7 meters in height. Quite wide, about 30 to 2 feet width at the base. But what is distinctive, and you can see how the top stones, which in Cumbria we call cams, overhang one side of the wall. And that gives an indication that actually sheep flock numbers were increasing, and there was more pressure for sheep trying to move to get to better grazing. So the tenants, in this case on the Rydal side, put those cams on to stop the sheep jumping over from the Ambleside side to do their grazing. Halfway down that wall, you can see stones sticking out, and I'll come on to this later on, but they are the through stones. And roughly they put those every metre or every 2 metres. Because at this stage, in the early time of the enclosure acts, there was a lot of walling gangs roaming around, semi-professional, doing a lot of the walls, and they would be paid by a simple old-fashioned measure called a rood, which roughly equated to about 5 to 7 metres in length. And actually, the surveyors would count the number of through stones to work out how much had been done by the walling teams and how much they needed paying. But ironically, obviously, as we got more sheep and the very fit hill breeds like Swale and Herdwicks, obviously they used to use these through stones to climb and jump over your walls. So you see a lot of walls with top fencing on, which is an unfortunate addition, but obviously part of the functional need in modern farming. So I've run through a bit of the history of walls there, what they indicate, but also features in the walls are really important. So this image here, these are the really old gate stoops, but in effect before metal gates became used and became cheaper and more prevalent. And again, these are slate gate stoops, and they had to drill out holes, and they put these split oak bars in, which are a beautiful feature, and you still see them here, there, and everywhere. But the fact that they've got those bars in also tell us that actually about the farming at the time, it wasn't very intensive. So actually the grazing in these pastures, they were basically pushed into the summer months for the rich grazing, and then they would be moved back closer to the farms where they would be given fodder over the winter. So they would be opened up in the summer, put the stock in, and then it would be barred up for a lot of the year when there wasn't any stock eating out. The image on the right there is slightly more recent, but they call that a ha-hung gate. So if obviously the big chunky gate stoops to hang gates on are quite expensive, quite bulky to move. So this was a cheaper way of being able to install a field gate without having to put these great stoops in. Perhaps not as attractive, but still quite interesting. So you'd have a big bit of slate there or sandstone, limestone sticking out of your wall, and then you drill a hole up to it and then put your metal pin in as a bracket on your gate. So it's quite a simple solution, and that one's in Wasdale. But if you look around, there's quite a lot of those around in the fells and in various places. But I think they're a really beautiful feature, and you can't see there, but at the ground level there's like a plate, a block with a little groove bit in for the opposite pin. So as I said, the walls are very much a functional feature of the landscape. So they were very much about obviously rotational grazing of your livestock. And you'll see a lot of these are what you call in Cumbria, they're called hog holes or schmoots. And often they'd have a big sort of blocking stone where you might let your hogs through and keep your ewes on one bit to move your grazing around, and basically to simply move your sheep between different fields. Sometimes you'll get versions of this, particularly where there's some wall sort of filtering down to one of these short sections of wall with one of these holes in. And they were actually for catching rabbits when rabbits were a lot more prevalent pre-mixing. Rabbit was quite a good food source for rural communities, and they actually used to have rabbit lunkies or hog holes. They're beautiful features, and they often have different names. So in Yorkshire, they can be called cripple holes. In Scotland, they're called lunky holes. So again, it's a lovely feature in walls. Sometimes you can see this image on the right, that's like a double one, and that serves, you can see, as a bit of a device when obviously this beck gets into full flood. So there isn't as much pressure trying to push the wall down. The water can flow through to relieve the pressure off the wall. And if you look in some valley bottoms, there's some walls which run along the floor of the valley, and there's multiple ones of these examples. So it's an early form of structure to do with the obviously rise and fall of water levels, particularly in those valley bottom land, when obviously flooding was a bit more impactful. So as we moved on, obviously flock numbers increased, and obviously the big allotments were built up from the base of the valley bottoms onto these fells in the later enclosure periods. So instead of having to move your fell flocks big distances, the farmers used to work cooperatively and do a lot of management in the fells themselves. And that's why you see these lovely sheepfolds. Sometimes they're called sheep washes. So you can see just at the end of the sheepfold, it's right near a beck, and there's a small enclosure in the sheepfold. So they bring the sheep out, maybe clip round the back end, around the claws, and then they dip them and wash them in the beck, and then probably to release them out. The image I showed early in the slide, that was a pinfold. Remember that Millennium pinfold at Ravensondale? They were very much for when the sheep were drove into the villages, there'd be lots of stray sheep from other commons and things, and they would get sorted there, and then the farmers would be notified from the other commons, and they'd have to come and collect the sheep. But these sheepfolds and sheep washes on the fells, they were very much within each individual common for sorting your sheep. And again, you might argue they're redundant today, but we've restored a few with our volunteers, and they're lovely features, and people really appreciate them. This is another similar functional feature called a bield. It's one of the examples on our land we own at Little Asby Common, where the volunteer teams have done a great job restoring them. And it's really good. This is a sort of moon shell, crescent moon shaped curved one. Some are in like a cross, some are in V's, and they're basically different shapes to allow the sheep and cattle to get behind whichever side is away from the prevailing wind. Because you can think the stock welfare on these exposed areas about when the freezing wind or driving rain's blowing, they can get fairly miserable. So it's a lovely feature to do that. If you think though, in the sort of total, there's about 3,000 miles of length of dry stone walls in Cumbria. So sadly, there isn't enough resources to maintain them all. So there will be some tough decisions moving forward about how many of these beautiful features get restored and conserved. And I know there is a group working across the whole of the UK and indeed internationally, working with the international conservation body, which is responsible for World Heritage Sites, but it's also responsible for doing sort of articles and statements on what they call intangible intrinsic values, and they're certainly looking at walls, both in terms of the features and the shapes and the historical evolution, but also the skill sets behind them as something which should be conserved and funded into the future. So it'd be interesting to see where that gets to in the future. So a feature in a wall, not necessarily related to agricultural livestock, or it probably was at the time, are these. And if anyone knows what these are called bee bowls, where you used to, I'll bring up the next image, but you used to put your beehive in these and your bee skeps into these bee bowls in the walls. This image is down at Grisbeck in the sort of southwest lakes. And I think it's the highest number in any one property. There's 21 bee bowls, and the Cumbria branch of the Walling Association had a visit a couple of weeks ago, and it was really good. So over the winter, you could see the skep was made of sort of woven, stripped bark and other timber, but they would often pack it with wool or straw to protect the beehive over the winter months. So again, if you see those, oh, that's what that feature was for. The really nice thing. So I'm just going to talk about a few different other types of wall which you do get in Cumbria. You might have seen these sort of Hawkshead, Coniston area. You get quite a lot, some around the Keswick area. There isn't many areas in the UK you'll get these. You can get them up at sort of Caithness, Snowdonia have some because obviously that's a big slate area, and also bits of Western Ireland have them, but they're called sort of shard or slate fencing. Often when they're on a roadside, and I'll bring up that slide, there's often a hedge behind them because they're often not tall enough to sort of keep your stock in at your modern densities. So often they're often backed up by a hedge on a hedge bank behind them. The image on the right there is part of the section of the Millennium Wall at the National Training Centre at Crooklands, just south of Kendal. As part of the Millennium, they built stretches of wall to represent all the different styles across the UK. And again, it's if you're down in that area, just off the motorway junction 36, it's well worth calling in to have a look at the different regional styles. Um, so another sort of hybrid form of wall are these like stone faced banks, which again, often this one isn't. This one's over near St. Bees, but they would basically build the stones into a bank double faced, but then they would often turf in between. I'll certainly put soil in behind, and often there was a hedge planted on the top of them, or even dead hedging in the early days. Obviously, the hedge is long gone here, sadly, and been replaced by a modern wire fence. But again, these earth banks are quite common. And actually, in the Victorian era, when they did a lot of the landscape gardening, they often built ha-ha walls where they create different levels in the wall. And you'd have like a single-faced retaining wall. And this image on the right there, that's a Cumbrian or Kendal-based wall, or a friend of mine who did this earth walling down in Cornwall. Some of the walls in Cornwall, they actually do quite intricate herringbone stone facing, which looks really nice. And sometimes it's sort of shaly slate down there. Sometimes it's a red sandstone. Sometimes it's a granite if it's in some of the Cornish walls. But because they're embedding the stone and the soil and often the hedge, they're often a very strong feature, and they can last many years indeed. And then just quickly jumping north of the border, this is a Galloway dyke, which when I'm going to go on to the modern walling building principles, but it's a bit arse about face really, because they've used some double-faced smaller stones to build the first half of the wall, and then they've stacked huge single irregular stones on the top, often with lots of gaps in between. And I think the theory is the sort of cattle and the sheep look at this wall and see the light protruding through the upper bit and go, I'm not going to go anywhere near on that, because if I try and jump over it, I'm probably going those massive boulders are probably going to trample me to death. So I'll probably keep away from it. But it's in, it's a nice variation. It's the same sort of function and the similar sort of principles and use of stone, but different names in different parts of the country, and different quirky ways of building it. Now, obviously, in the Friends, we care about all boundaries, and I've mentioned there's about 3,000 miles of walls in Cumbria, and hedges, I think there's about 12,500. But hedges often get the attention when we think about wildlife. But if you think about wildlife which utilises walls, it might shelter in a wall, or that top image of that toad, it might hibernate in the wall over the winter. Um, the snail there, I was building a wall near Oxenholme just in the early spring, and there was literally thousands of snails which had hibernated in this wall. It was a bit tragic because you can imagine the noise and the crushing sounds when I was taking this wall down to rebuild it. I tried to save as many as I could, but it's quite tricky. And then the bottom left image there, that you'll know that's a pied wagtail. And often where a wall's slumped and moved a little bit over the years, there's often gaps and they'll go in there. And often have nests. I've seen pied wagtails and other birds nesting in walls and bringing up a clutch. Equally, I've seen weasels and other small mammals using walls for breeding and sheltering. And then the bottom right image there, I've already touched on that. Again, they create a nice microclimate for various bits of vegetation to grow and flourish on there, which then obviously supports other species. So if you've got a pen and want to make note of these, obviously Helen will share the presentation around afterwards and things, but these are two books I'd really recommend because I've only scratched the surface of the evolution of the walls. The book on the right written by Professor Angus Winchester, he's a history professor at Lancaster University, but he supplied a lot of those images I've used in the presentation looking at the evolution of the walls in the Lake District. And I'd really recommend you getting this book. It's quite a small book, but it's a brilliant sort of social evolutionary history of walls in the northern uplands, indeed elsewhere in the UK. The image on the right, that was a sort of commemorative book the Cumbria, or the sorry, the National Dry Stone Wall Association produced for its 40th anniversary. And they've got some beautiful images in there. They've even featured a little wall project which I did, which I was quite pleased. Thankfully, they don't put my name in there, but that's worth a buy as well if you can get hold of that. So right, I'm coming on to the modern way that we're generally building walls, which is mimicked those enclosure walls, those modern walls. So this is like a cross section through a wall. So you can see what I've been saying. It's a double face. There's two different faces of stones built on top of each other, and then through stones holding the two sides together. And then the top stones in Cumbria cope stones or cam stones fit the two together. But often when we're building a wall, certainly when you're building a wall in a long length or with lots of different wallers working at different speeds and perhaps with different skill levels, you'll often put one of these frames up which frame the shape of the wall, and then you lift your string lines up as you build up. So I know I'm not doing a training course, but I'm going to run through the core principles. If you're going to build a nice strong dry stone wall, we don't use any cement because that actually creates weakness. But if you're going to create a strong wall, these are the key principles. So always put the length, the longest axis of the stone into the wall. You can see from the image, you're going to put your big stones at the base because they weigh the most. And a bit like your foundations, you want that strength at the base in order to build up from. You can see the bottom left image. You can see when you build up each layer or course at a time, you cross the joint below, because if you don't, you get a long vertical running weakness. So again, you cross your joints as you build up. You want to keep every stone horizontal, every level, as you do with every course as you build up. There was an early old wives' tale or old person's tale that if you angled your stones, tip your stones downwards a little bit, the water would flow out. Well, that's absolute nonsense because you basically create a weakness on a ski slope. Every stone you place horizontally. When we build a wall, you never try and create strength or stability by putting little stones in pins from the outside. You certainly, in the center of the wall, you've got something called hearting, and you can certainly wedge them at the back to stabilize your stone. But if you rely on the structural strength by pinning little stones in from the outside and they fall out, as they inevitably do over time and weathering and weather, then you basically create a huge weakness. You put the hearting in the center and you don't just pour it in with buckets, you place it in, you tuck it in to get your stones level and make it jam-packed tight and airtight and make it really strong. Generally, if you're rebuilding a wall, generally I say that whoever built it in the first time, maybe a couple of 100 years before, they probably put the stone in correctly. So if you've got a weathered face which has been exposed to the elements for years, generally it's got lichens and it's got a different coloration, that's probably the face you're going to use on the outside when you rebuild it. It gives you a good clue. And when you're building a wall, it's very much a tactile 3D jigsaw, and I call it mindfulness because you're so focused on getting each stone right and getting the courses right. It's always valuable to step back away from your wall at times and just see, right, have I got the courses right? Have I crossed all my joints? And then look along the length of the wall to make sure you're building a nice straight line, your batter's angling in on that A shape so it's narrower at the top than the base. So just keep an eye on that, and just remember, as I say, it isn't an easy skill. The principles sound simple, but actually putting them into practice takes years of skills. And the good thing is the friends obviously work with the Cumbria Walling Association and lots of other partners, and we run competitions. We started the competition in 1980, and we helped create the Cumbria branch of the Walling Association at that time. Because at that stage, there was very little grant money for walls. Farmers were still in intensification mode, and we were seeing a lot of decline of walls. So we started the competition to get more people doing the skill and learning it, but also improving quality and skills. And this is an image from this year's walling competition we held with the Arnside and Silverdale National Landscape down at Leighton Hall. Lydia at the forefront of that picture, she's an amazing master craftsman waller over from West Yorkshire. She came second in the professional class, which was the top class, which we're looking at. The guy bending over in the middle, that's Jack. He lives near me in Kendal. He's become a really good waller. I got him going, but he's a lot better than me now. He came second in that class. So we on the day, I think we had 21 wallers spread between the professionals here, the sort of next stage up, the improvers. Then we had a group of complete beginners working together, and then we had a veteran class. We had a brilliant day, and we built about 50 meters of wall, and it's a good. We must have had, 150 members of the public coming along during the day because there's a footpath nearby, and it's a lovely way of showcasing the skill and getting a demonstration going. And this is another example of a competition quite a few years back in Dentdale. You can see the stones there, quite cobbly. They've probably come out of a beck or cleared off the field. Those two wallers are really good master craftsmen. On the left, Stephen Allen from T-Bay. On the right, Andrew Mason from near Kirby Lonsdale, both master craftsmen. And I've learnt a lot from these guys. They're absolutely fantastic. Both of them built quite a few of the Millennium Walls with Andy Goldsworthy, and then subsequently they went all over the world, America, Saudi, building walls under Andy Goldsworthy's instruction and things. But I'm from Yorkshire, so I always used to be big-headed and say all the best you wallers are from Yorkshire. But I've come to realise they're not. The best wallers do come from Cumbria, and I think that reflects the fact that the weather's awful, the terrain's challenging, but also the geology is really complex. So having walled a fair bit in Cumbria, I've walled with slate, limestone, granite, sandstone, red sandstone, and soft and different types of sandstone. We've got every type of rock and geology in Cumbria. And I think because of that, you have to be quite flexible and canny on how you build walls. So I do believe the Cumbrian walls are probably the best going. So Helen mentioned in the intro, I do a bit of training. I'm the sort of training officer for the Cumbria branch of the Walling Association. I do a little bit of training for the Friends, and I do it a bit in my own time. So this was an image just in April for a Woodland Trust volunteers. I had 4 of them and 5 of them on one day, and you can see the quality of the wall I've put up there. That was the first time they'd done this wall. So by giving them the correct guidance, using those principles I mentioned earlier, and putting this little frame up to keep them all on the same sort of template, you can see what beautiful wall they've built. And now they're up and running. They can do maintenance work, which they'll do on, I think, about 8 properties in the South Cumbria area going forward. So this image on the right, this was a wall which formed part of a project with the Lake District National Park, just the other side of the wall, between that and the River Kent at Staveley. It was a miles without styles path. And the landowner didn't want bikes and other users encroaching onto his meadowland, which is actually now a beautiful hay meadow. So he wanted us to put a wall up. Now, there wasn't any stone on site. So we actually moved 400 tons of slate stone from Kirby Moor Quarry in the southwest onto this site, believe it or not. So we organised a Friends of Lake District walling competition, which built 60 metres of it. Then we worked with the Walling Association. We had what's called a wallathon, where we had basically 70 wallers over a weekend, and they built 140 metres of a wall over a weekend. And then what was left of the 240 metres, we built in another couple of days with some of the extra people who were willing to come back. So we built a brand new section, 240 metres of dry stone wall, which was a hell of an effort. And I have to say, it's a lovely feature if you're ever in that part of the lakes. So if you want to do a bit of walling yourselves, the Friends have a great volunteer army, and we own 13 different properties. Not all of them have walls on, but this one, the right image there is on Little Asby Common, a bit of land at Mason Wath, and the volunteers have built literally hundreds and hundreds of meters of wall. They've done a fantastic job. It's a lovely limestone, and it always blows my mind when you think that limestone was formed 350 million years ago. And you are tactically holding that ancient rock when you're building that wall. It just blows my mind that. The image on the left, that was from the Felcare Day last year, and that is a Ordovician metamorphic, really heavy, dense rock. So that was formed 450 million years ago, and this was at Outgate, our more National Trust land, within a wood. And again, some volunteers were experienced and some were brand new, and they did a great job. And the sense of satisfaction building a wall on either coming on one of our work parties on the Felcare days are absolutely fantastic. And Helen will cover volunteer opportunities when I've stopped rabbiting on. So this was a funny little slide. This is us, part of our display at the Westmoreland County Show last year. And this is a little magnetic wall, a little hands-on have a go for young children that we've borrowed off the Cumbria branch of the Dry Stone Walling Association. this little girl, she was absolutely transfixed. Her parents wanted to move on, but she did this wall 3 times, and she was so into it. And all the kids were getting stuck in and helping it. It's a really simple way of engaging people, and as I say, because it's quite a tactile, hands-on thing, people really like having a go and getting stuck in. So I think that's all I want to rabbit on for. How long have I talked for? That's not too bad. Just about 40 minutes, I think, Helen. So I think you're going to see if anyone's got any challenging questions for me. I hope that was okay, everyone.
That's perfect, Jack. We'll start with some easy questions, I think, and kind of um, uh, pivoting off that lovely picture of you with the young girl. Where was when did you first work on a wall? So, and where was it? So, how old were you when you worked on your first wall, and where was it?
Well, I was brought up on the North York Moors, and sadly, there was virtually nil conservation work at that stage. So it wasn't until I went to university at Newcastle in '87, then went out with a volunteer group that did a bit of walling. But I was fairly hopeless then. It wasn't until I moved to the lakes to work at the national park in '92 that I started going on more training events. And I got a lot better then, but it wasn't until I went self-employed and did a lot of contract walling that I became, fairly proficient at it. So it's like I said, you can learn the principles quite quickly to jump from a complete novice to a reasonably competent professional. It takes a lot of years. I always say that every stone you put on a wall goes into your subconscious memory somewhere. So when you've put millions of stones up, you can do it in your sleep.
Fantastic, fantastic. A question from Steph. So, Duddon Valley History have been surveying shard fences, so the vertical slate slabs. Doesn't seem to be any reason why odd lengths exist between regular dry stone sections. Do you have any thoughts on why this would be?
I honestly think it's purely functional. It was basically if you remember, a lot of these walls were built from what was close at hand because stone is heavy and it's costly to move. So in the early days, they moved it as little as possible. Having said that, some of the shard slate fence pieces, particularly the narrow ones, could have easily been robbed for ornamental work, and possibly some gate stoops over the years.
Oh, that's really helpful. If anybody else got any more questions, hang on, there's some more coming in. Let me just have a little look down. Um, so from Basak, thank you. I learned a lot about the age of the walls. I want to know if training is to restore the old walls or also building new ones.
Predominantly, we're restoring existing ones. Um, I always say a wall's an amazing feature. If you think of what we call if you think of the green side of it, the embodied energy and actually collecting, moving, quarrying, and building the stone, there's a huge amount of energy in that. Generally, if you're going to create a new field boundary now, you're better off putting a hedge in because there isn't as much energy to put it in and get it going than building a wall. The exception, you do get exceptions like that Miles Without Styles wall at Staveley. But a lot of the wallers make their money now, not from building agricultural walls, but doing arty-farty things at the Chelsea Flower Show and building walls in millionaires' gardens and estates and things. So there isn't as much new wall building. Certainly on the volunteer side, and generally, yeah, we're restoring existing historic features.
Brilliant. Another question from Anne. Is she too old to start at 60? She's done a half day intro 18 months ago, but would love to do it because you've inspired her.
No, not at all. We go out, we get people from the age of 15 up to 90 dry stone walling with us. I mentioned George Allenby, worked with Steve Allen on that sheepfold at Ravenston. George is now 83 and he's still doing walling, commercial walling jobs. He only does a morning a day, but he's still working every week of the year. Amazing, man. No, so definitely take part. And as well as our opportunities, obviously, I've mentioned the Dry Stone Walling Association a few times. Go on their website. They do courses, they do an intensive course. So if you've done a fair bit already and you're competent, you can do a 4-day course. And at the end of the week, you can do an assessment for your first qualification. There's 4 levels of training skill you can acquire through accreditation. So like beginner or initial, then intermediate where you build a wall end and 2.5 meters of wall, intermediate, and then advanced, build some features and a curved wall, and then you can become a master craftsman. So there's 4 levels of qualification you can work your way up through. But yeah, go to dswa.org.uk and find out your training opportunities. The Cumbria branch, we run 4 weekend beginners training days a year. So on the Saturday we're at Crooklands at the National Training Centre, and then the Sunday we're at a real farm as we call it. So it doesn't get it goes up and stays up. That's at Alton at the moment on the Dunning farm near High Chapel.
Fantastic. A question from Alison. She noticed the A-frame used didn't seem to be symmetrical in the photos. Is that right, or was it just?
No, I hope it was the angle of the image rather than a mess up of that. Yeah, it
It
should have.
should be symmetrical, the A-frame, when you're walling.
Yeah, as a rough rule of thumb on those modern enclosure walls, the width of the foundations, when you go up to the below the top stones, your cams, the width of the base is twice that at the top. So you can see that's why the angle of those frames are in what we call an A shape, and that angle is called the batter. So you always reinforce that when you obviously reconstruct your wall.
Brilliant. A question from Cordula. If you wall with boulders, like rather round outliers, how do you get the wall stable? Do you split them?
No, if you can avoid putting a hammer to a big boulder, then that's sensible because if it's made of metamorphic rock, your hammer's like to bounce off and smack you in the head. Um, no, what you notice with the cobbled walls, often their batter's a lot steeper, so they're a lot wider at the base, and then they taper in faster because often where those walls occur, there isn't the long through stones. Sometimes there is, but sometimes there isn't. So you compensate by making them a bit thicker. But it's the same principles when you're walling with cobbles. You try and sit them as level as you can in a cup between the ones below. Put the length into the wall you best you can. But as I say, often the batter's a bit steeper, and you can sometimes step in a little bit more each time. And if you go to some of the valleys where they have got a bit of slate nearby, like in Langdale, they'll put some flatter ones as intermittent stones as you build up to create a bit more stability where it's needed. But you stick to the same principles and you will get there in the end. But what you need to do is when you build up, try and gather a few cobbles of a similar sort of depth when you're building a course at the same time, and that'll make life a little bit easier.
Brilliant. Another question from Melanie. How much could you wall in a day as a pro, and what do
Oh
you
yes, I
charge?
should have mentioned
I
that,
think
shouldn't
you
I?
got to work here. Is walling
Yeah.
included in environment schemes for landowners?
Yeah, no, that's spot on those questions. So yeah, professional wall, you're going to build between 3 and 8 meters a day. Going anything above 5 meters, generally you've probably got a lower wall. You've got the bigger the stone, the quicker it's going to go up. Generally, you're charging between 40 and sort of £80 a meter, depending the size of the stone, the size of the wall, the trickiness of the site, who your client might be, I might say as well. Um, and you and the grant, unfortunately, unlike hedges, the grant rate doesn't through for the grants to farmers through the farm grants are only about £33 a metre, I think, at best. So they don't actually pay for the full amount. And that's why we're not getting as much walling done through those means as possible. But again, the advantage is a wall still has a really important functional value in a livestock farming system. That's going to be a debate down the line. You can already see as some of the valleys go to a more sort of rewilded,
Yeah.
extensive livestock system, then obviously the functional need for such a network of walls doesn't exist. You can see quite a lot of walls tumbling down.
Mm.
So, at some point, some people's going to have to say we're going to have to do an audit of what we've got and try and prioritize what we are going to fund to restore.
That's great. And a final question, I think, because it's a good one to end on. Um, what's your favourite wall, Jack, if you have one?
Well, do you know what? I say I've wall with everything, and I absolutely adore, although it does some people's heads in, is walling with walls built from old limestone pavement because you get all the irregular shapes, you get the lovely weather-worn little runnels in them and things. If you're up near Scout Scar near Kennedy, you can see the amazing like the wall. It's sad they ripped up the limestone pavement to build these walls, but anyhow, that's happened. And the good thing with that carboniferous limestone, it's often got tiny little fossils on, but it's very grippy. So once you've lifted it up and you've put it on right, it's really grippy indeed. One thing I want to mention, Helen, I should have said just to finish, a lot of people, if you're getting some work done at home, For God's sake, don't let any builders slap a load of cement in your wall or to cement your top stones on, because if you think about it, modern cement might last 15 years. A stone will last hundreds of years. And also, because we're post-glacial, the ground and the soil is moving. So when you build a wall, it can, because it hasn't got cement in, it's got a bit of flexibility and it can settle and move a little bit. Whereas if you put cement in, you create a rigidity. And if you get any movement, like if there's a big tree and the wind's blowing and the roots move the wall and it's cemented, it can tumble down. So if you're getting any stonework done, if you can move to a non-cement based structure and get it built well, then it is far, perversely, it's far, far stronger than slapping in a load of cement.
Fantastic, Jack. Could you just put up the last slide, Jack, for me, and I
Oh,
will
yes, sorry, Alan.
finish up. That's all right. Fantastic. I just wanted to finish by, well, A, thanking Jack for, I think we're all inspired. So he's got a whole section as wanting to go off and wall. If people want to look back at the presentation, I know Jack talked about seeing the books that he's recommended. We'll load it all onto our YouTube channel, and that will go out with our newsletter this week. If you're not signed up to our newsletter, please do that. You can do that on our website. I'd encourage people, if you're not a member already, do think about whether you can support our work financially. So membership costs from just £2.75 a month. Again, look on our website. And you can very definitely volunteer with us. If you're interested in volunteering specifically to do some walling, then look for the work parties at Mazenwath. Please do let us know, though, as you sign up for those, if you haven't got any experience with walling. We try and get the right balance of people who can wall to not too many volunteers who are doing walling for the first time joining at those events. So do let us know. And then just to flag a few of our upcoming events, we've got a big open day on the Helm a week on Saturday. So all kinds of things going on, things for the children in terms of storytelling and crafts. But there's also, I think Jack is leading a guided walk on the Helm, and we've got some volunteer work parties happening as well. So do join us for that. If you've been inspired by Jack about walls, but want to find out about a bit more about hedgerows, Jack is also leading some of our learning about landscape on the 15th of July, which will be a kind of a walk and talk looking at hedgerows and flower-rich verges. Or our next guided walk, we've had one on this afternoon, but there's another one on Great Asby Scar, and you'll get to see some of the fantastic limestone pavements that Jack's just been talking about. So that's on the 13th of August. But thanks again for joining us. You've been a great crowd. Thanks for all your questions, and please do keep in touch. Thank you.